First of all, I want to begin by thanking the founder of this feast, Mr. Daniel Rose, who is joining us for the day. It's really his generosity that makes possible the Henry Louis Gates Jr. Lectureship, which is now in its third iteration. So thank you to Mr. Rose, and thank you and welcome back to New Haven. I also want to thank Mr. Rose's old friend, Henry Louis Gates Jr., whose work has inspired so many of us across the disciplines and across the years since he left Yale in the early 1980s. It was impossible for Professor Gates to be here today, and he asked me to convey his deep regrets to Daniel Rose, but also to our speaker and to all of you as well. And now it is my great honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Patricia J. Williams, currently the James Dorr Professor of Law at Columbia University. Professor Williams took her BA at Wellesley and her JD at Harvard. She first worked as a deputy city attorney in Los Angeles and then as a staff lawyer for the Western Center on Law and Poverty before becoming a professor of law. She taught at Wisconsin School of Law, at the City University of New York Law School, and Golden Gate University School of Law. She joined the faculty of Columbia Law in 1991. She's been honored with fellowships at Dartmouth College and at the Center for the Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and she is a MacArthur Fellow as well. Professor Williams has been a prolific and tireless writer on issues of race, gender, the law, and social justice, as well as on legal theory. Her many books include The Alchemy of Race and Rights, 1992, The Rooster's Egg on the Persistence of Prejudice, 1997, Seeing a Colorblind Future, The Paradox of Race, in 1998, and Open House, of Family, Friends, Food, Piano Lessons, and the Search for a Room of My Own, in 2005, which Skip Gates himself called a seductive meditation on the personal and political from one of the great theorists of race and law. In addition to her books, Williams' trenchant writing is regularly and happily to be encountered in her Diary of a Mad Law Professor for The Nation and her Mad Law Professor's blog. And she's frequently cited when they are getting it right in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsweek, and elsewhere. The very first sentence of her first book announced that a unique sensibility had arrived on the scene. Since subject position is everything in my analysis of law, she wrote, you deserve to know that it is a bad morning. Bad, we find out, because Williams' job as a lawyer is now requiring her to wade through an 1835 Louisiana case on prohibitory vice, that is, defective merchandise, involving a defective slave named Kate. Bad, too, because all the news is so bad. AIDS is spreading amid evident indifference. Greenhouse gas has just become a worry. Inequalities and disparities of all sorts are widening. Racialized violence punctuates the nightly news, and the carceral state has come looming out of the swamp. And bad, too, because the McNeil-Lehrer report has just reported Harvard Law School dean's contention that to hire even one black woman professor would require lowering Harvard's standards. Beginning with this bad morning in about 1989, and ever since, Patricia Williams has woven these strands: the racialized and gendered nature of American law, contemporary social conditions as reflected in our daily headlines, the racialized nature of our legal institutions, and the contention that subject position is everything, into a tapestry of critique that is damning, unsparing, compelling, and yet also strangely hopeful in its power to illuminate, in its wit, in its elegance, in its originality and creativity. If she can do this on a bad morning, she provoked a whole generation to suppose, then the world isn't merely bleak. She also provoked a generation of legal practitioners and scholars to think differently about how the law is embedded in history, and a generation of students and professors across the humanities and social sciences to think differently about how history is embedded in the law. And I can't resist telling you A few days ago, a colleague of mine saw me carrying a copy of The Alchemy of Race and Rights and said, "Oh my God, when I was in grad school, we passed that book around like a joint." William's career as a public voice runs basically from the Rodney King beating and the Thomas Hill hearings to this season of Michael Brown, John Crawford, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Walter Scott, and Eric Harris. Here's just a paragraph that has been haunting me from her recent writing. August brought us John Crawford, Jr. Crawford was shopping at a Walmart in Beaver Creek, Ohio, when he picked from the shelf an airsoft rifle that was for sale. He continued shopping, ambling through the aisles while talking with his wife on a cell phone. Someone called the police to say a man was waving a gun at women and babies. Police arrived and quickly shot Crawford in the back. A grand jury found his death a justified use of force, although video cameras recorded Crawford's motions, showing definitively that he never waved the gun around, never pointed it at anyone, never moved sharply or hastily, and that other shoppers seemed to be calmly pursuing their business all around him with no fear or aversion. It was, according to prosecutor Mark Pipemeyer, just a perfect storm of circumstances, a tragedy, a tragic case with no bad guys. Williams continues, "I suppose it is too easy to note that Crawford was black. Surely there are other observations, such as, it is insane that toy guns are made to look like real ones, or it is insane that Walmart sells real guns as well as toy ones, both ever so casually located somewhere between bedding and paper towels, or it is insane that after a 9-year-old girl killed her instructor while trying to operate an Uzi at an event in Colorado, neither her parents nor the gun range were held criminally responsible." "I do not posit these reflections to underscore the power of racial stereotypes," she wrote. "Ferguson is also about the vivid yet deadly hallucinations that have led us into full-blown war with ourselves." Deadly hallucinations that have led us into full-blown war with ourselves, and that's the thing that's been haunting me for the while since I read this piece. From the Rodney King beating onward, for 20 years and more, we have needed Williams' voice and her insight. Tonight, at what still feels a precarious moment, we are very lucky indeed to welcome Patricia Williams to Yale for the annual Henry Louis Gates Jr. Lecture.
Thank you so much for that incredibly generous and kind introduction. I'm very indebted to you. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Mr. Rose, for your sponsorship of this appearance. Again, it is my pleasure and my honor. At war with ourselves, I am really struck by the news of just within the last few days, a leaked report apparently from the Missouri National Guard shows that protesters were referred to as enemy forces. And the militarization of that language abides with me at this moment. And then today, this morning, the front of today's New York Times features a story calculating that approximately 1.5 million black men are absent from daily life in the United States, mostly through early death or incarceration. And this has apparently resulted in a lifelong gender gap that is not found among white Americans. These men are missing, as the article puts it. In effect, they have disappeared from view, absent, invisible, unmourned. Making them appear or reappear is, of course, why hashtag Black Lives Matter is so important, as is excavating the hole this leaves not only in the lives of black women, which seem to be a major focus of this piece, not only the hole they leave in the lives of black families and children, but in our polity, among white citizens, and in the world at large. So how do we bring them into view? Envision what is our perpetual erasure of them and the inadequate ritual effort of such eternal return. We have been dusting off all our anthropological microscopes and telescopes and social lenses and polishing our binoculars, trying to bring each other into focus, particularly since Ferguson. And it's a moment filled with a kind of new faith in cameras as granting us moral transparency, particularly in the area of law enforcement. If we see it, we will know it. Of course, this new faith requires old skills of perhaps film theory and criticism in order to understand what there is to be seen. First, let me say that I really do think it is a good idea. Cameras on police dashboards, wearable cameras on police officers. It has also been suggested that citizens, particularly black citizens, should arm themselves with little cameras embedded in their clothing, Google glasses and Google hats and Google t-shirts, tracking themselves as they live their lives, quietly, ceaselessly, in a ritual of perpetual exoneration, like performance art. Quietly, ceaselessly, black men should be tracked so as to mind the ex post facto transmission of agency, as in the killing of Walter Scott. The theater of that death in North Charleston, North Carolina, began with a litany like so many before it. It began with a chant we know by heart, a prayer we can say together. He reached for my weapon, a struggle ensued. I feared for my life, the weapon discharged. Amen. What most of us would now call the reality of Scott's death was provided by a passerby with a quite good long-range lens on his cell phone, a counter-narrative of the subaltern, one we knew before we knew, a memory remembered, a recall and response. He was running away. He was shot in the back. He was unarmed. The weapon was planted. Repeat this chorus at the end of every verse. Now, of course, we know that seeing doesn't guarantee the seen. We know the empiricism of digital recording is not the same as resolving whatever it purports to show. We have cameras on street corners, cameras in schools. We have cameras on subways, in prisons, libraries, and outer space. And on the back of every dollar bill, we have our destiny engraved, the all-seeing eye of Providence upon us all the time. We see Rodney King being beaten. We see Tamir Rice being shot. We see Eric Garner being strangled. We do see. And we see what we want to see. And so today I thought I'd tell you 8 short stories, 8 quick stories of the obvious, the occluded, impaired vision, scrambled imagery, socio-visual agnosia, belated recognition, and regret. I made up that term, socio-visual agnosia, in case you were wondering. There is an actual neurological condition called visual agnosia, and if you've ever read Oliver Sacks's The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, the patient in that eponymously titled essay suffered from visual agnosia, an inability to recognize objects or faces, or to identify a thing by its shape. It's not really a vision problem at all. It's a neural disorder of perception, impairing the ability to attach proper meanings or to interpret or recognize what is seen. So I'm taking a bit of liberty here, but I find it helpful to deploy it as a metaphor, as a cultural malady as well, a hermeneutic disease, if you will, an afflictive affliction, an affective affliction, a kind of warped circuitry in the adaptational transaction between self and surroundings. And so my first story is about the man who mistook his gun for a taser. Robert Bates is, of course, the 73-year-old insurance agent whose best friend is Stanley Glantz, the sheriff of Tulsa County. Bates has contributed thousands of dollars to the department over the years, including vacations for the top brass, police vehicles, and the surveillance equipment used by the Drug Task Force in Tulsa. It seemed, I guess, only polite to invite him along to test these goodies out. Now, this is an exercise some call pay to play. Cash-strapped government offices appreciate their major donors. Public offices providing necessary public services are grateful to citizens with deep pockets who step up to the plate in these hard times. Who would begrudge a small return, a gratitude of favors, small things like ride-alongs and prison tours? So, donation is probably not the right word. It is often just a little more. Offer and acceptance, tit for rat-a-tat-tat. It more resembles contract, a benignly homegrown version of disaster touring. And so when an unarmed black man named Eric Harris tried to make a run for it during a thoroughly bungled sting, Robert Bates, thrill-seeking insurance agent, volunteer hanger-on who was not trained as an officer, who had never gone through police academy, although he had appeared on Cops, reached for his taser and pulled out his gun. Now, I am sure it was an accident. I am sure it was the worst day of his life, as he professed. "I shot him," said Bates in pure surprise. "I am sorry," said Bates. It was the worst day of his life. Now, pay to play has quite a genealogy. Some decades ago, Joe Hodge, then governor of the Texas Board of Corrections, he used to invite his pals down to the prison and engage in what was a long-standing tradition among officials, to wit, a staged hunt of inmates, ostensibly as part of an exercise to train tracking dogs. Hodge and his friends would enjoy a nice leisurely lunch while an inmate called the Dog Boy was given a head start of a few hours to crisscross 8 square miles of the prison compound. Then the party of official guests mounted horses, assembled 8 or 9 dogs, and rode off after the designated escapee. After the exercise, there was a sumptuous barbecue, and participants received jackets embroidered with the words, "The Ultimate Hunt." Mr. Hodge defended the practice, saying it was a prestigious job for prisoners, and indeed a recent parolee was quoted as describing the chase as a blast. "It was like I was free. I sure did like that after being inside that building for so long." In addition, he was offered a reduction of his sentence. Again, pay to play is framed as contract, a something for a something. In this instance, temporary freedom and perhaps quicker ultimate release in exchange for becoming the quarry for dogs from the perspective of the prisoner. And for the gentlemen hunters, they went away well-fed with a good story about hounds and horses, and again, to top it off, that gift, a souvenir, the cowboy jacket, upon the back of which had been embroidered that very catchy coda, "The Ultimate Hunt." The ultimate hunt. It anticipates, it hungers for, it so wants for a reality show to go with. It could have, should have been perhaps. It is as though, to fill in that subjunctive mood, that more recently, Arizona's Sheriff Joe Arpaio offered actor Steven Seagal a tank, an actual tank, my kingdom for a tank, with which to break up a coven of animal cruelty, a conspiracy of cockfighters, a dangerous den of rioting roosters, the original cage fighters, right there in Maricopa County. Sheriff Arpaio needed good publicity, it seems, and Steven Seagal had a reality show and a TV crew at hand, which filmed him driving said tank along with a SWAT team and a bomb robot through the front wall of the poultry harboring residence, crushing to death the family's new puppy. The warrior birds were taken into custody and killed. Now, you may have heard about this incident because there was so much discussion about whether killing the puppy was absolutely necessary. And killing the cocks to save them from cruelty lent irony to the endeavor. It is a quandary sometimes how to save the animals from themselves. And so you may have heard also about the story, more recently, of Corey Knowlton, a man who won an auction at the Dallas Safari Club. And he paid $350,000 for the privilege of shooting a black rhino, a species close to extinction, magnificent creatures whose numbers are below, I believe, 2,000. And Mr. Knowlton explains that he is actually helping their survival because he plans to cull only an older, cranky bull, giving younger black rhino males the chance to rise to the top of the hierarchy of aggression. It's the circle of life. Plus, the money goes to the government of Namibia, which needs it to pay its park rangers to protect against poachers, which Mr. Knowlton most emphatically is not, for that would be the circular thinking of life. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service plans to make an exception to its rules against importation of endangered wildlife. They will permit him to import the carcass as a trophy, given his great contribution to the greater good. Meanwhile, back in Texas, wild hogs are far from going extinct, apparently. Rather, there is an overpopulation of them, as you may have heard, at least as asserted by many farmers over whose land they roam. And in another act of public-spirited volunteerism and pay-to-play, singer Ted Nugent saved the day. Nugent enjoys, apparently, machine gunning hogs, as he expressed it. Pigs turn me on. So, armed with a helicopter and a machine gun, I believe it was last week or the week before, he flew over a range, sprang a wide arc of bullets down upon the ground. In one swooping rain of firepower, he killed 455 of the varmints. He had quite a good time, apparently, since he conducted the hunt live on Sirius Radio and dedicated the kill to Bill Maher and, quote, other animal rights freaks. Now, it should be noted that there is a law in Texas against aerial hunting. But in an efficient economy of public-private exchange, Nugent's sortie has not been considered sports hunting, but rather recast for purposes of the law as population control. Where do these ideas come from? Where, oh where, oh where? Story number 2. In 2011, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, in his endless hunt for migrant laborers, launched what he called an air posse. And as the word posse implies, it was made up of 30 private planes staffed by, quote, citizen vigilantes and deputies from human smuggling and drug enforcement units, all of them armed with M16s and a .50 caliber machine gun. According to Arpaio, we're going to use our automatic weapons if we have to, and I'm tired of my deputies having to chase these people, and I'm sure the air posse will be able to spot these guys running, as they constantly do from us. Now, also reported on Sirius and beyond, reporters in Texas have been describing crowds of citizens calling for the immediate deportation of unaccompanied minors, fleeing across the border from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. They fear the children, some as young as 6, as disease-bearing, parasitic upon tax dollars, and criminally inclined. Not our children, not our problem, reads a sign one woman holds. And radically scattered elements drift to mind in no particular chronological order, yet suddenly linked. A photo I saw years ago of a classroom in Guatemala, barefoot but a chalkboard on one of the walls. The village in which it was located was so war-torn, families fleeing from place to place, that the determined children who could make it to school would bring their own chairs and sometimes their own weapons from wherever was home each day. I wonder, yet farther back in time, to the 1940s when the United States government conducted non-consensual experiments upon hundreds of Guatemalan prostitutes, prisoners, and mental patients, injecting them with syphilis and gonorrhea just to see what would happen. chickens coming home to roost is an aphorism of which my grandmother was extremely fond. And she always used it to describe the legacy of slavery, the way in which children are born full of light and joy. But when old enough to be turned out to work the fields, they come back at the end of the day with a dark kind of cruelty lurking behind their eyes. And my thoughts meander in a different direction to recent revelations about the Blackwater Guards finally condemned to a prison sentence, who, for their gunning down 17 innocent civilians in Baghdad in 2007. Weeks before that incident, many have forgotten that this was really a tragic turning point in the supposed quest for Iraqi hearts and minds. But weeks before that shooting, the State Department had launched an investigation into the degree of criminality and chaos for which Blackwater was already allegedly responsible. And that investigation was actually blockaded outright. Blackwater's spokesman in Iraq told the State Department's lead investigator that he should watch himself, for he could kill him at this very moment, and no one could or would do anything about it. And immediately thereafter, the investigator from the State Department was ordered home for disrupting the American embassy's relationship, not with Iraq, but with Blackwater. I think, too, of the violent breach of medical and military ethics in our government's attempted deploy of doctors to monitor the administration of torture in Guantanamo Bay. And my scattered thoughts roll on to the general public health emergency of our failed health system, such that 40 to 60% of those who land in our jails or prisons are suffering from untreated mental illness. I think of the National Gun Lobby that tenaciously holds background checks on, refuses to hold background checks of any sort, and calls that its own definition of insanity. And I think of Abu Ghraib and Charles Grainer. Charles Grainer is a free man since 2011, after serving 6 years of a 10-year sentence. And he was also well known well before he stacked prisoners into pyramids or attached electrodes to their testicles or beat them to death or gave the thumbs up over their corpses. Grainer, before he left for Iraq, had been a prison guard in Pennsylvania, and there he'd been accused of abuse on many occasions, including an incident in 1998, where, according to the Washington Post, Grainer and 3 other guards put a razor blade in a prisoner's food, and then Grainer allegedly beat the prisoner before getting him to the hospital, telling him to shut up, nigger, before we kill you. Although a federal magistrate ruled that the case had arguable merit in fact and law, it was dismissed when the prisoner was released and then, like so many others, disappeared. This takes me to my next story about Rikers Island, where so many of those arrested under the NYPD's so-called stop and frisk policy of targeting those who commit very minor infractions end up. Rikers is a holding facility, not a prison, meaning that the vast majority of those at Rikers are not convicts, but only awaiting arraignment or trial, or if convicted, have received sentences no longer than a year. Yet Rikers inmates suffer staggering and disproportionate rates of serious beatings, requiring hospitalization and other abuse, the use of force having more than doubled in the last 5 years. The New York Times did a phenomenal excavation of this reality. And the impunity with which these beatings has taken place is beyond doubt, for many of the assaults have been captured on camera in surveillance videos, although even that is exacerbated by guards removing inmates from areas that have surveillance cameras in order to beat them in the medical unit, often in the presence of distressed medical staff. Apparently, medical units do not have cameras to protect privacy. So according to this 4-month investigation that the New York Times did, it has been, quote, common practice, normalized brutality for beatings to go on at the clinic because of the lack of cameras. And despite thorough documentation by the city's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, by the Board of Corrections, by the Department of Corrections, by the Health Department, by the Office of the Medical Examiner, the New York Times, and the Mayor's Office, there have been no prosecutions to date of which I am aware. Said the Bronx District Attorney's Office, some of these cases, from Rikers Island in particular, some of the witnesses, they disappear, they scatter. Of course, there were lots of witnesses to the July death of Eric Garner. He was killed after police throttled him, and this was ruled a homicide. I use that word advisedly. After police throttled him because they thought he was selling Lucy's without a license. And a cell phone video of the confrontation, while going viral, was really intriguing, not simply because of the use of the long band technique called a chokehold. The sad politics of that we are all familiar with. What I was most struck at was the behavior of the emergency medical technicians who stood alongside police and did nothing, idly peering down at him as he lay unconscious, watching him die, administering neither CPR nor defibrillation, even as gathered onlookers shouted at them to do so. Now, according to a national comorbidity study and the National Institutes of Health, approximately 3.5% of the American population suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. About 14% of New York City firefighters have PTSD, as well as 20% of Iraqi war veterans, 31% of prison guards, and more than half of all prison inmates. And according to a study by the Safer Foundation, up to 68% of incarcerated women. My next story is a story about our having gotten to the point that not shooting seems to have become remarkable. Again, just last week, a man suspected of murder and suffering from mental illness, but unarmed, threw himself at police officers shouting, "Shoot me, shoot me." The policeman did not shoot him, and as recorded by the officer's camera, the man was unbalanced but capable of being subdued. And he was subdued, handcuffed, and carted away. Yet, if you remember, much of the press congratulated the police officer in language that I found troubling. They praised him not for keeping his cool, or for assessing the situation and acting appropriately. Rather, it was repeatedly described as a suicide by cop attempt, and that the police officer didn't fall for it, as though the police's task were to fight against the passive inevitability of being the instrumentality of the subject's will. A hero, this police officer was described for resisting the invitation to shoot the man. He didn't let the suspect turn his hand into a lethal weapon. He refused to let the suspect wrest bullets from his gun. He didn't obey when the suspect ordered him to kill. And the agency here is weird. And I think of it as, I tend to call it the ventriloquism of the passive voice. The passive voice is used to bury the agency and to reassign responsibility, as sometimes in these situations, the active voice is used to animate the passive. But this is a species of puppetry that short-circuits painful yet crucial opportunities to reflect upon the complexities of power and its absolutes. And I worry we have dulled our responses to the sharp moral questions we might otherwise have to confront. In recent years, again, an increasing number of such confrontations are called police-assisted suicide, or again, suicide by cop. And this unfortunate terminology shifts agency away from a public officer who, justifiably or not, actually makes the decision to fire his weapon. It redescribes the police as passive extensions of the outlandish will of the deceased. By law, police actions are constrained by the reasonable exercise of force, but why bother with all that if dying was by the crazy person's choice rather than at the officer's hand. It is the sort of shifted responsibility you used to hear in fiction that used to come out of the Wild West, the frontier West, when some people would say, he needed killin'. It used to be that kind of cliche, common, perhaps, as a regionalism of the South, used as a cipher for vigilante justice. It referred casually to extra-legal justice or an impassioned response to a particularly heinous crime. It meant that someone or maybe a group of vigilantes took it upon themselves to do away with a dastardly criminal without due process, without benefit of jury, without benefit of doubt or appeal, because it is a mark that does not have the right to have rights, as political scientist Margaret Summers might put it. Now, this is also pay to play, and a consequence of narrow cost-benefit thinking is that the exchange not only is deadly, but cheapens us, the polity, the state. I've written before about the serial killer in the Bay Area, a man who strangled his victims, and convicted and sentenced to death. He begged the state to hang him. He apparently got as much erotic pleasure from strangulation as Ted Nugent gets from machine gunning pigs. What a peculiar moral lens we are left with if we view executions as choice, as preference, when we over-endow prisoners with an autonomy far beyond the constricted options of the very circumstance or of imprisonment, and simultaneously under-endow the state with responsibility for the fate of those within its sphere of life and death control. Without such a commitment, we will have really eviscerated the meaning of habeas corpus. It is the responsibility of police to use least force possible, to de-escalate passions, not inflame them, to distinguish among guilty and innocent, addled and distressed. It is not an easy job, particularly in a society as well-armed as ours. But it points to the necessity of a politics that is beyond cost-cutting or carelessly probabilistic profiling or throwing bigger and better weapons at an already inflamed social setting. And there is a terrible familiarity, a repetition to these crises, the incoherent policies of bunkering and quarantine, the criminalization of whole populations, the militarized purported necessity of human degradation, the bloody, splashing repercussion of retributive justice. And so the witnesses scatter, the chickens come home to roost. And I remain curious about the explosive histories that sent those chickens flying into distant disorder, but that we assign to oblivion as they now glide back to earth, drifting like embers and ashes, the regrouping phoenixes of reiterated traumas. I'm left with an ominous vision of flocks of mean-spirited birds, broken-winged and brooding, gathering in unnatural silence as though before a storm. My next to the last story, number 7. And this was actually the subject of a column I did, for those of you who read my column, about going out to dinner in Manhattan to a nice little Japanese restaurant on the Upper West Side. And it was around 5:30 in the afternoon. The place was filled with mothers and fathers after school, kids with their books spread out amid this platters of sushi. And right in the middle of the miso soup course, the place was robbed. And 2 skinny teenagers, probably no more than 15 years old, had come in, and when the waitress turned her back, seized the cash box and fled, with 5 staff members pounding after them to no avail. It was very sudden, it was very unnerving, and I was left with a kind of fairy tale lack of resolution. Fists were shaken, no one died, life continued, shaken but not substantially stirred, and police weren't even called, because it's New York, and because the maitre d' explained with a shrug that there wasn't a lot of cash. It's a mostly credit card establishment. And in the truly only in New York form, People went back to their meals, and children went back to their homework, and the place resumed the murmurs of conversation and clinking crockery. And next to me, there was an understandably distressed mother. She was at a table in the throes of the adrenaline everyone in the establishment was suffering, and she lashed out at those horrible people. But the longer she went on, the more it became clear that the plural, as she used it, was broader than just the two kids who had come and gone. Her indictment of those and of people was of some vastly expanding plural, some big bang repercussion of universal horribleness, the object of whom extended far beyond the two skinny kids who ran off with the till. But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was listening to her child, for therein lies the hinge of the next generation. This child of only 5 or 6 began to muse aloud about what he'd do to bad guys if he ever caught them. The little boy's piping voice carried well, as he really was quite gleefully, as little kids do, imagining all the things he'd do if he ever caught the robber, or a robber. And it was vivid and astonishingly graphic. I assume he picked it up from video games, but honestly, his little rant reminded me nothing so much as two cultural influences. First, the kind that little girls are subject to who are already so conflicted about their body image that the first thing they do with a Barbie doll is cut off her hair and then snap off her head. The second cultural reference that came to mind was that of our great and iconic jurist, the Right Honorable William Blackstone, who was so eloquent on the subject of drawing and quartering. From his 18th century commentaries, he described drawing, which means putting on a rack and stretching the body so all the joints are dismembered, and then quartering, which requires that the body be sawed into at least 4 pieces, and that then the forgotten parts of the ritual, as in draining the blood, splitting heads, putting heads on spikes, and so forth. Anyway, the sound and the fury and the details that this child imagined tactics of torture had a resonance that seemed delivered across centuries. And so it was that it stayed with me a while. And it stayed with me while I finished my meal and then walked up the street 2 blocks to a book party for Nell Bernstein and her new book, Burning Down the House. And her book is about juvenile detention in the United States, where children and young teens are thrown into prisons and become the objects of all of that little boy's elaborate fantasies. Though that little boy wasn't old enough to imagine the degree of sexual assault in real juvenile facilities. He hasn't yet imagined all the details, like the kids sent to solitary for months at a time, or kneeling on glass for 12 hours at a time, or if they soil themselves, they have to clean it up themselves afterwards. As a general ethic of violence and torture in juvenile prisons, by and large, that little boy in the restaurant had pretty much inhaled the cultural narrative of racialized punishment, danger, dehumanization, and the need to make these horrible people, as his mother put it, disappear. And as I sat at this party and listened to Nell Bernstein and realized that she was recounting exactly what this little boy in the restaurant had dreamed of doing to those people, I reflected upon the fact that these are real bodies upon whom that retribution is enacted, from whom the imagined price is paid. These are real children who are the children of the nannies that abound all over Manhattan. They are children who've grown up in foster care, or who have emotional problems, or who've themselves been victim of crimes. They are abused kids, kids who've been raped and trafficked, but sometimes they are just kids who haven't done much of anything wrong. They're kids from so-called million-dollar blocks where police concentrate all their superpowers. They're kids with arrest warrants issued for riding bikes on sidewalks or having a dusting of marijuana on their person. Those whose scuffles, as Nell Bernstein puts it, on the basketball court lead not to being benched, but rather to a month's worth of solitary confinement. They are miscreants, mischief makers, children with special needs. One of the women at the book party asked in astonishment, "Isn't this illegal, what guards do to kids who've been locked up?" And Nell responded, "Of course. And when those kids who are in there for having a joint get beaten up and raped by their keepers, they learn that it really isn't about what they have done. It's all about who they are. So who are they? What is going on in our heads? And I'll end with my 8th story, the story I call The Woman Who Fell from the Sky. And this is a story about stories. It's about the degree to which race is an overwhelmingly capacious proxy for narratives of intellect and criminality and sexuality and economics and health and geography, free will, fear of failure, and the will to keep on going. It is a multi-layered story that I pose in juxtaposition to the story with which I began of the 1.5 million black men who have disappeared, even though this is about the body of a woman who committed suicide by leaping out a window with her 10-month-old baby strapped to her chest in one of those snuggly little Baby Bjorn type carriers. And the first story I read was this headline in the New York Post: "Baby survives Harlem mother's death leap," because you can always rely on the New York Post for honest concision. There is just so much packed into those few words, no? Just the word Harlem instantly shapes assumptions about what happened. She must be black, desperately poor, a bad mother, probably on drugs. Enough said. End of story. And you can imagine the online commentary to precisely that effect. The next day, however, the New York Daily News, coming a little late to the story, ran the report on its website under this headline: "Manhattan mother jumps 8 stories to her death with her infant son strapped to her chest. Baby survives with minor injuries." With Manhattan as the modifier, this mother was more likely to be seen in online commentary as white and as selfish, as desperately ambitious, and not on enough drugs for what was assumed to be postpartum depression. Now, as it turned out, this mother was also an employee of the Manhattan State Supreme Court and a graduate of Columbia Law School. Of course, there was a stereotyped narrative for that as well. Glenn Beck's news site, The Blaze, reported the story as "Lawyer mother leaps from 8-story building," and commentary from readers was peppered with surmise about whether the woman was a feminazi with a liberal death wish and with relief that there was one less lawyer in the world. And finally, 3 days later, there was this headline, which straddled the question of identity with a bit of ambiguity. Sources say Harlem lawyer Cynthia Wachenheim penned a 13-page handwritten suicide note before jumping out of an 8th-story window, taking her son, Keston, with her. The baby was saved from the impact when the woman landed on her back on the pavement. And commentators were pretty confused about this one. Harlem lawyer, last name Wachenheim, son with a funny Ebonics-sounding name like Keston, and they were quite enraged. Anyway, I saved all of the headlines about this incident, and there were more, and turned them into this PowerPoint that I shared at a conference not long ago. And an audience member remarked that she was just blown away by the story. She said that it was beyond tragic, such a terrible mystery as to why all these women were jumping off buildings with babies strapped to their chests. To say nothing of the fact that all the babies survived every single time. Anyway, I tell you all of this because I am so intrigued by the kinds of progression that these headlines reproduce. There was, just to reassure you, only one woman jumping out of her 8th-floor window, yet 8 levels of degradation, 8 stories of dying. This mother falling over and over through multiply headlined categories of being, descending through multiple ontological layers to her inescapable doom. Cynthia Walkenheim, Harlemite and Manhattanite, accomplished lawyer and Columbia Law School graduate, depressed wife and bad mother, became a floating signifier in death. More than one being in our cultural narrative, torn into pieces by powerfully loaded descriptors in the mouths of others. And I wish there were some kind of balm in writing about the pain of that incident. I so wish I could will into being another ending. But this is not an easy world. We live in very vexed times on an exhausted planet where more and more are and will be subject to fewer and fewer of life's necessities like clean water, air, enough to eat, shelter, and kindness. It is sometimes very hard to find the inspiration and resilience necessary to expand and contract in the face of all these dismembering social forces. And I was very moved at lunch as many of you, students and faculty, spoke of the university as a place to think in collective ways about our collective problems, about not losing ourselves, about providing stewardship, about knowing that the world will be a cruel run at times. So girding ourselves, as the airlines tell us, by donning our parachutes, putting on your oxygen masks, putting on stilts to rise above it all, donning our high-heeled running sneakers and emotional sponges, crash helmets and pillowed landing gear. So when challenged by walls, when thrown off cliffs, we can learn to become Spider-Man and Wonder Woman, prepared as well as gifted with supernatural powers. We so need these gathered powers of thought. We must continue to provide the cushions from full body blows, the softer landings, the gentler understandings, weaving the safety net that will sustain all of us, our babies, our boys, our girls, our parents, our politicians, and our police, so that they might all face this world with resilience and kindness. And when thrown for a loop or from a great height, we might bounce back up unbroken and carry on. Thank you.